there might be hundreds of them. And every rectangle will have an x and a height and its top a width, and will have a move left function that will do something like this. Wouldn't it be nice if I can define a class called rectangle that looks something like this, that has some sort of a blueprint like this, and then from this class I can create various objects, object 1, object 2, object 3. That is what classes let you do. The syntax looks something like this. That's how you define a class. This is how I sort of wrote it. Yeah, this class में 4 variables होंगे, and there will be a function that looks like this. To actually define a class in JavaScript, the syntax looks like this. You write the keyword class followed by the name of the class. In our case, the name of the class is rectangle because all of these are various rectangles that you want. Class rectangle, where you always have to define a first function called constructor. Always is a wrong term. There are also classes that don't have constructors, but generally, whenever you define a class, you define a constructor along with it. उस class के अंदर आप एक function लिखते हो called constructor. Now you might ask, this doesn't look like a function. आपने function space constructor नहीं लिखा है. You have simply written constructor followed by the arguments. And yes, that is how you can write functions attached to classes or inside classes. You can simply write, can here have constructor that exists for every class. Every class that you're defining, be it a rectangle class, in the future a shape class, a people class, a dog class, an animal class, you will number 1 attach a constructor to it. And the constructor will take all the initial values of this rectangle in this case. ये जो function है इसका काम ये है कि whenever a new object is created from the class, जब भी इस class से ये नया rectangle बन रहा है, whenever from this class a new rectangle is made, इस क्या constructor में जो width, height और color, you have to understand this new thing called constructor, and then we also have to understand about this variable. Yes, these are the 3 things we need to understand. This is how you define the class. Every class will have a constructor. The goal of the constructor is that this constructor gets called whenever a new object is created. Whenever I create a new rectangle, the constructor function will get called. It is supposed to construct the object. It is supposed to create the object from this class. And how does it create? It attaches जो width, height, color आपने दी है to this variable, such that whenever area is called on this function, this dot width would represent जिस width से आपने उसको initialize किया. I repeat, if you look at this class, let's replace this definition with the class that is created over here. If you look at this class, what does this class say? कि जब भी नया rectangle बनाना है, whenever you want to create a new rectangle, you will create it like this. Let R1 equal to new rectangle. आप कोड में इसको ऐसे लिखोगे. Let R1 equal to new rectangle. The width of the rectangle 100. Let's say you want to initialize from this class. One. What will it do? It will call the area function per width set to whatever color was passed over here that was red. So R1 dot width. Now I can call that function on various objects of that class. This is just one object of the height of 100, color of yellow. Take R. We have to learn today is that someone has already written. That is the site. This is loosely typed. You can always call a function without passing the third argument. I pass the right color like. Draw some space. Need to know the perimeter of that rectangle, which is simple. If I log this, what should it log? What is the perimeter of a rectangle? Log the area of the rectangle. कहाँ दिखा है? Const variable name equal to new something. What is this? This is also classes that JavaScript provides you by default. अभी तो मैंने बड़ी class खुद से लिखी है. We have to write a constructor function, a bunch of attached functions. What promises are for a bunch of other classes JavaScript provides you by default. For example, there is a date class in JavaScript. Const d equal to new date. ये syntax हमने कहाँ दिखा है? Const variable name equal to new something. What is this? This is again a class. Just like a while back, we had created a rectangle class and called const r equal to new rectangle. Similarly, indexing, it has 0-base indexing, hence it returns 5. If I do a d.get month, what do you expect it to return? It returns 1, I think, which is your month number 1, that's February, month number 0 is January. Then similarly, if I do d.get year, what do you expect it to return? It returns something like 2026. So there is a date class that is already defined. That's how you use the date class. And similarly, there is a rectangle class that I defined myself. Find myself, the syntax looks something like this. Hopefully that makes it clear. It's just another syntax that we have to remember. But why did we introduce classes? Because it has some properties that make it sort of useful in a very big project. This thing by class, when I call new date, this date class का जो constructor है, that gets called. When we did the same thing in our rectangle class, whenever you do const r equal to new rectangle, this thing right here, what actually is happening is the constructor that is supposed to construct the object is getting called. And what is the constructor doing? It is attaching to this rect the width, height and color that were passed as arguments over here. Methods, functions that are defined inside the class can be used by all instances of the class. So you can always call, rect.perimeter, rect.area, so on and so forth. Inheritance. ये concept है will come to very soon. Static methods is a concept will come to very soon. Getters and setters, again a concept will coming to very soon. Do we understand itna? Do we understand creating classes and creating objects on top of these classes? Let's do a poll. Not clear, wrong way to say it, but ऐसे समझने की कोशिश करो कि when you create a new object of a class, when I say new rectangle, what is happening is something like this is being stored in memory. Yeah, there is a new rectangle whose width is something, whatever the properties are that we have. Width is something, height is something, color is red, and it has these functions available. There is a perimeter function available. There is a area function available. Now you can create many such rectangles. एक rectangle तो है नहीं ऐसा, ऐसे काफी सारे rectangle हैं. All of these rectangles have a perimeter function. All of these rectangles have a area function. Notice the perimeter function does not take any rectangle as an input. अगर classes नहीं exist करती, how would you create rectangles? You do something like this. Let r1 equal to width green. That's how you create that way. That takes that object as an input is an easy thing. What is the harder thing? The harder thing is what we are doing, which is we have defined a class. Functions, we are not passing methods on top of those objects to classes, which is what is done over here. What you do is you define a constructor whose job is to construct those. Then this is the second object, r. The r1 जिस पे area call हो रहा है. The r1 object, the r2 object. तो r1 not right. What you do is you don't pass any arguments. Classes is good, active, something like this. A very futile sort of function that when you call, it returns something like cat is what's called a non-static method. This perimeter, non-static method. What does that mean? You can call them like this. You can also define a static method, something like this. Who am I? Normal दिखने में एकदम function जैसा ही है. Can take many arguments. Can return whatever you want it to return. Return I am a rectangle. A very futile sort of function that when you call, it returns something like I am a rectangle. But it is a static method. What that means is कि इस let's simply call इस मेथड को आप एक ऑब्जेक्ट के ऊपर नहीं बुला सकते. You can't call console.log r1.whoami. You can't call r1.whoami. If I run this, it throws an error. It says r1.whoami is not a function. ऐसा कैसे हो गया? r1.area is a function very well defined over here. r1.perimeter, if I call, it will still work. It is a function that exists on the class. But when I call r1.whoami, which is this method right here, it doesn't work. If I remove static, of course it will work. If I add static, it doesn't work. So what are static methods? And why do you use them? Static methods are methods जो सीधा class पे attached होते हैं और internal objects पे attached नहीं होते. A static method you can call like this: rectangle.whoami. This will not throw an error. It is on an object. Up you come to when they are checked. I can't call rectangle.area. Rectangle class.area में call नहीं कर सकता. क्यों? क्योंकि I have not created an object of the rectangle class yet. There is no width height attached to an object. In fact, if you call rectangle.area, what would this variable be? कोई this variable बना ही नहीं है. There is no object that has been created, and hence calling rectangle.area makes no sense. Creating an object, let r equal to new rectangle, giving it a width, height, and a color, and then calling r directly on the class. Metadata functions that are just attached to the class. वहाँ पे static methods use होते हैं. Specifically, it has 2-3 use cases that we'll see eventually. Great. Classes have a very specific, it's like a very textbook definition of, why should you use classes, and what is object-oriented programming, and what is inheritance. So we just have to understand it once. Let's quickly go through it. Rarely will you create classes that need inheritance in TypeScript. I have almost never used it, but like there are some use cases where you can write modular code where you do use inheritance. But you don't use it very often. Still something you have to learn. So if you understand classes, if you understand how this rectangle class was created, let's quickly understand inheritance also. So let's say I create a rectangle class which has an area function and a whatever perimeter function, and then it also has a paint function. जिसका अभी के लिए the job is just to log console.log painting with color, whatever the color is, which is this dot color. This class we can read. I have defined a class called rectangle. The class has a constructor and now has three methods: area, perimeter, and paint. Let's say there is another class I create called the circle class. Let's say we are creating Flappy Bird where there are circular obstacles and rectangular obstacles. Here, you would probably need a constructor. So you will need a constructor which takes what as an input. For a rectangle, does width and height make sense? No. What makes sense? Radius. Hello. How's everyone doing? Rectangle dot who am I? This will not throw an error. सीधा class पे अगर कुछ call करना है, which means if you're calling it on the class, that means there are no attributes, there is no width, there is no height that has been created on an object. आप object के ऊपर नहीं बुला रहे हो. You are calling it directly on the class. Those are called static methods used in very specific use cases. If you've heard of singletons, वहाँ पे use होते हैं. We'll come to when they are used, what is their purpose. But what are static methods in classes? Static methods are methods that are called directly on the class. What are non-static methods? Methods that are called on objects. I can't call rectangle.area. Rectangle class.area में call नहीं कर सकता. क्यों? क्योंकि I have not created an object of the rectangle class yet. There is no width height attached to an object. If you called rectangle.area, what would this variable be? कोई this variable बना ही नहीं है. There is no object that has been created, and hence calling rectangle.area makes no sense. Creating an object, let r equal to new rectangle, giving it a width, height, and a color, and then calling r.area does make sense. So this is correct. What you saw before was incorrect. You can't call area directly on the class, but you can call static methods directly on the class. Basically, अगर 4-5 methods attach करने हैं जिनका object से कुछ लेना देना नहीं है, if you want to attach 4-5 methods to a class that you don't need an object for, they're like some metadata functions that are just attached to the class. वहाँ पे static methods use होते हैं. Specifically, it has 2-3 use cases that we'll see eventually. Great. Classes have a very specific, it's like a very textbook definition of, why should you use classes, and what is object oriented programming, and what is inheritance. So we just have to understand it once. Let's write modulars create, perimeter function, and then it also has a paint function. This ka, abhi ke liye the job is just to log console.log painting with color, whatever the color is, which is this dot color. This class we can read. I have defined a class called rectangle. The class has a constructor and now has three methods: area, perimeter, and paint. Let's say there is another class I create called the circle class. Let's say we are creating Flappy Bird where there are circular obstacles and rectangular obstacles. Here, you would probably need a constructor. So you need a constructor which takes what as an input. For a rectangle, does width and height make sense? No. What makes sense? Radius. The only thing that makes sense is radius, because it is a circle. Circle, that's the only property you need to define the circle. And then it should ideally also have an area function. So area, which would in this case return something like 3.14 into this dot radius into this dot radius. Hopefully this is like textbook math and you understand. The area of a circle is this, and the perimeter of a circle is whatever. 2 into this dot radius. Sorry, what is it, like 3. This I totally forgot. 2 into 3.14 into 2 pi r. I think so. I think this is right. I could be wrong. So I might be wrong. This is what I remember. Pi r square and 2 pi r. I think this is fine. And then lastly, it will also need a function called paint, which would again simply do whatever the rectangle function did. ये functionality थोड़ी common है. Both the shapes have a color. Both the shapes have a method that looks very similar. Both the shapes should have a color. Sorry, class circle should also have a color. And both the shapes will have a paint method where if you log, the same thing is happening. Ideally, something different would happen here. Rectangle gets painted a certain way, circle gets painted a certain way. But assume it's the same for now. Let's say there's a third class you have to define called square. Again, there's a constructor. 2 into 3.14 into 2. Define the class called rectangle. The class has a constructor and now has three methods: area, perimeter, and paint. Let's say there is another class I create called the circle class. Let's say we are creating Flappy Bird where there are that is returns I remember pi r square and 2 pi r. I think this is fine. And then lastly, it will also need a function called paint, which would again simply do whatever the rectangle function did. ये functionality थोड़ी common है. Both the shapes have a color. Both the shapes have a method that looks very similar. Both the shapes should have a color. Sorry, class circle should also have a color. And both the shapes will have a paint method where if you log, the same thing is happening. Ideally, something different would happen here. Rectangle gets painted a certain way, circle gets painted a certain way, but assume it's the same for now. Let's say there's a third class you have to define called square. Again, there's a constructor. What would a square have? It will just have a side and the color. This dot side equal to side. This dot side equal to color. A function called area returns this dot side into this dot side. A function called perimeter returns returns whatever 2 or 4 into this dot side. And a function called color, which is the same as the function defined below. Sorry, paint, which is the same in all three of the classes, which simply logs something. So effectively, I now created three classes. Rectangle class has width, height, color. Circle class has side, color. Square has, called color, which is the same as the function defined below. Sorry, paint, which is the same in all three of the classes, which simply logs something. So effectively, I now created three classes. Rectangle class has width, height, color. Circle class has side, color. Square has, side and color. Circle has radius and color. All three of them have one functionality that is very common. So if you really look at it, if you compare the three classes, let's open class number 1. Let's put it over here. The rectangle class. Let's open class number 2. Circle. Put it over here. The circle class. Let's take class number 3. Put it at the end, which is the square class. If you take these three classes, is there some code that is sort of repeated in all three? For sure, this paint method is exactly the same in all three. In तीनों में paint method is common. Also, every shape that we create will have the same paint method. Every shape that we create will always have a color variable set. यहाँ पे थोड़ा सा this is like incorrect. I hope you guys understand. This part is incorrect. It should be this dot color equal to color, something like this. So all three classes that I have defined have some code which is sort of repeated. You know, this code right here should be the same as this code right here. But I forgot to color. All classes take a color yourself. एक चीज को बार-बार मत लिखो. And now with inheritance we can do the same thing. Inheritance in JavaScript classes allows one class to inherit properties and methods from another class. One class to inherit properties and methods from. It would be nice if they're all written in a single place. A rectangle, circle, and square are all shapes. So what if I could define a shape class where I can have the paint function written only once. The paint function written only once. And even जो color को set करने का logic, it's very simple logic. But wouldn't it be nice if the shape class has a constructor which takes color as an input and simply sets this dot color equal to color, something like this? Wouldn't that be great? That is what inheritance lets you do. It lets you define a constructor and a bunch of methods, a bunch of properties, and from another class. These three classes can inherit the color property property. The code is being repeated in all three places. Versus, it would be nice if I don't have to define it in three places and only define it in one place. Making it easier to create new classes that are based on existing ones without having to write duplicated code. Would it be nice? अगर मैंने ये तीनों classes जो बनाई हैं, rectangle, circle, and square, I can define a class called shape. Paint move from the rectangle class. Paint method मैं यहाँ पे define नहीं करूँगा. I will simply have it in the shape class. Don't need to have the method written over. Secondly, this dot color की जो set करना है, that also I am doing this in the shape class. That way, this common logic moves to the shape class, and all three of these, the rectangle, the circle, and square, don't need to have the method written over. Secondly, this dot color की जो set करना है, that also I am doing in the parent class. So I can also remove this from here. I can remove this dot color from here. I can remove this dot color from here. It is already happening in the parent class. The way to attach these child classes to the parent classes is class rectangle extends the shape class. Class circle properties from the shape class. Shape class has a color, a way to set color the same. ये मतलब ये use नहीं है. One more thing that you have to do is whenever the constructor is called for with whatever arguments it expects. In this case, the third argument is the color. In this case, the second argument is the color. So you need to extract the right argument that the parent class expects and pass that to the parent class's constructor. The way to do that is not shape.constructor, it is calling this super method. Super का मतलब होता है मेरा जो parent class property. Similarly in square, it is the same. You know, उनका logic आपको नहीं लिखना पड़ेगा. But the common, extend this way. Suppose the common code has been moved to the parent class, equal to new circle, which takes, and things like that. We'll take the width and height to not in class, and not in, we move it to the parent class. The parent class has a constructor. The child classes don't set this, this dot color. ये भी हमने logic यहाँ से हटा दिया. This dot color set करने का logic, and we moved it to the parent class. The other extra thing we did was in all three of these cases, we called, super with whatever the, there's a base class where there's a paint method. If I want, I can also define the area method here. But what if I want in the shape class, I can define the area. But whoever extends the shape class needs to inherit here. Whoever inherited from me, they should have implemented it. So if I want in the shape class, I can define the area. But whoever extends the shape class needs to override the area method. Yeah, the shape class area method is a very unusable method that is thrown error. The square class actually overrides that. This class forgot to implement it. Then you will see a very descriptive error like this. अगर मैं area मान लो define करना भूल से here, it will throw a very clear implement this method. Then I will define the base classes to override कि भाई आप भूल गए को area method को implement करना भूल गए. This error doesn't get thrown. The area method in the base class actually overrides. So the subclass actually overrides the base class. Various places, but not something we'll touch for basically. Q&A and I'll proceed. Is class solution yes? Yeah. For example, now 89%, very small, quick 5 minute, not 5 minutes, 2 minute Q&A, and I'll proceed. Is class illusion? Yes, yeah, it is. It is. You'll find it in a few cases, mostly for this only. There's some functionality that you can extract out in a base class, you do it. But generally, it's not used as much. The dot then promise is static. No, it isn't, right? You define a new object, let p equal to new promise, and then you call p dot then. So no, it is not static. It is a non-static method. यूज केस क्या है क्लासेस इनहेरिटेंस का? एक्चुअल में बढ़िया काम आएगा when we actually see it in action. We can try to create something like Flappy Bird where we see rectangles and circles as obstacles, and there we can sort of force it in, but it's not as obvious right now because we're not hitting a case where there's a lot of common functionality between two classes. But you will find use cases like these. Please explain the super keyword. The goal of the super keyword here is whenever the constructor is called for one of these classes, when you call super, what it does is it calls the parent classes constructor. हमारी जो parent class है उसमें constructor है, उसमें ये logic लिखा है. This logic is not present here. This dot color set करने वाला. I've added that logic in the parent class. If you want, you can add it here. But either way, whenever a constructor is called for a class, the first thing you have to do is call the constructor of the parent class with the right arguments. In this case, the right argument is the third argument here. It expects the color and sets the color to be whatever the input that the user gave, and hence you need to call super at the top of your class with the exact color. अगर ये नहीं करोगे, then and if you do something like this, it's fine. It sort of works. But the reason it was done in JavaScript कि नहीं भाई आप shape अगर extend कर रहे हो सबसे ऊपर आपको super को call करना है is because there will be a constructor in your parent class. That constructor might require some arguments, and you need to clearly specify what those arguments are. If let's say it took color and I don't know, let's say this is like a 3D shape which has width, height, and depth. And depth all of them will have, right? A square will have a depth, rectangle will have a depth. जो inputs आए थे उनमें the third argument के साथ call करना है. Whoever has written the parent class doesn't necessarily follow the same conventions that you did here. You wrote depth color, he expects color depth. Let's actually extend this more. Let's say we do add the depth functionality. Let's say there's a shape class, and we've added depth here. So side, depth, and then what is the volume? Area into depth, right? Where should the volume function is square and circle to be to this dot radius. Shapes will have a depth now. Circle as different for this. That is whatever, few centimeters here and few inches over here. So that is sort of common functionality that every shape will have. Hence, the depth can be moved to the parent class, and the volume can also be moved to the parent class. This dot area function to this dot depth. Now you might ask, this dot area तो error throw कर रहा था. Yes, but again it will get overridden in the base class. Rectangle में वो area function ऐसा दिखने लगेगा, and hence the volume function will call the area function of the rectangle multiplied by depth. That's the benefit of using base class. Maybe here's another good benefit. कि अगर आपको depth functionality डालनी है, the function can be moved to a common parent class than being an individual base class. I'll look at some more questions. Then what do we need to do if we use two different objects in a function? Then you'll define a function. Let's say there's a function, who, if s1.shape is greater than s2 volume, and you can call with, can't create a, what if I, can you do this? I'm not super sure. I think Java it's possible here it isn't. No. Classes can come to, later, implements. But to extend, you can only extend one class. What is implement, we'll come to when we reach. To summarize, there is this, some of the common classes that we generally deal with are the date class, and, object variable classes are the date class. There's a map class that lets you do something closer to what objects let you do. Objects where you can set key value pairs, get key value pairs. You can also do it like this using maps. Not an important class to know right now. Promise is an important sort of a class to know about. And calling promises is easy. Defining your own promise is where things get hard. So in the end, promise is nothing but a class. It is a class just like the date class, just like the rectangle class. This is not a, that let. class, just like the rectangle class, just like the square class. You can also code the promise class yourself if you want. It's like not very difficult to code if you know in programming. But what it introduces is like sort of weird and hard to digest. तो धीरे-धीरे समझने की कोशिश करेंगे. Let's go through the official definition that looks like this. A promise in a JavaScript class is an object. Variable classes are the date class. There's a map class that lets you do something closer to what objects let you do. Objects where you can set key value pairs, get key value pairs. You can also do it like this using maps. Not an important class to know right now. Promise is an important sort of a class to know about. And calling the promises is easy. Defining your own promise is where things get hard. So in the end, promise is nothing but a class. It is a class just like the date class, just like the rectangle class, just like the square class. You can also code the promise class yourself if you want. It's like not very difficult to code if you know async programming. But what it introduces is like sort of weird and hard to digest. So धीरे-धीरे समझने की कोशिश करेंगे. Let's go through the official definition that looks like this. A promise in a JavaScript class is an object. The promise is a class. There is a promise class. Usse you can create objects. So const p1 equal to new promise, something like this. Let p1 equal to new promise. Just like we did a let b equal to new date. This is also known as a promise ka object, or this को भी कभी-कभी promise ही बोल देते हैं. This is the promise class. This is an object of the promise class. But generally when we say promises, we just mean this object. A promise is an object that represents the eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. That represents the eventual completion of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. We have seen this before. Let's create a new file called the eventual completion of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. We have seen this before. Let's create a new file called a.txt जिसके अंदर मैं कुछ हाइडर लिख रहा हूँ. Do we remember this from the last class? const fs equal to require fs dot read file sync तो सबको याद होगा. Let what whatever, contents equal to fs.read file sync, a.txt utf8. If I log the contents, it will print something like, whatever I wrote in the file, which was hi there. File के अंदर hi there लिखा था, I was able to read it. This is the synchronous way of reading a file. Do we remember the asynchronous way? We discussed in the last class there are IO bound tasks and there are CPU bound tasks. Reading a file is an IO bound task. Why? Because when you basically call this function, you ask the operating system कि please मुझे file के contents दे दो, and operating system will in its own time return you the contents. That could take 10 milliseconds, that could take 100 milliseconds, that could take 20 seconds based on how busy the operating system is. In those 20 seconds, your JavaScript thread remains stuck over here, and hence we understood there is another way to call read file, which is simply calling read file and not read file sync. When you do fs.read file, if you remember from the last class, then writing this simple way. ये कितना आसान था लिखना, const, whatever, contents equal to this thing, console.log contents. If there are two